The letter arrived on a Tuesday, slipped between a bill for the water heater and a flyer for a local lawn care service. Frank Turner saw it when he came back from his morning walk, the one he took every day at 7:15, rain or shine, because the doctor said his knees needed the movement and because the house felt too quiet without Patricia's voice filling the rooms. He picked it up off the mat, turned it over, and recognized the return address immediately. A law firm. Probate division. He'd been expecting it for weeks, ever since his mother had passed, but somehow the sight of the envelope still made his chest tighten. He set it on the kitchen counter next to the coffee maker and went about his routine. Fill the carafe, measure the grounds, press the button, and listen to the gurgle and hiss of water heating. He'd been doing this same dance for 47 years, ever since he was a young man with a bride and a baby on the way and a postal route that started at dawn. The coffee maker was the same one he'd bought in 1998, a relic with a stained glass carafe and a timer that had never worked right. Patricia had wanted to replace it a dozen times. Frank had always said no. Now she was gone, living her new life in a gated community near Naples, Florida, with a retired dentist named Gerald who wore white pants and played pickleball. Frank didn't begrudge her that. She'd been unhappy for years, and he knew it. He just hadn't known how to fix it. He'd worked all the time, double shifts and overtime, because that was what you did. You provided. You put food on the table and shoes on the kids' feet and money in the college fund. You didn't think about whether your wife felt lonely or whether your children would one day look at you like you were a stranger in your own living room. He poured his coffee and sat down at the table. The envelope sat across from him like an accusation. He picked it up, slid his thumb under the flap, and pulled out the contents. A single page. Formal language. The estate of Margaret Turner, his mother, had been settled. The farm, 37 acres of land with a house that had been in the family for 3 generations, was now his. Frank read the words 3 times, waiting for something to stir inside him. Grief, maybe, or a sense of closure. But all he felt was a dull resignation, the familiar weight of being handed something nobody else wanted. He'd spent his life accepting what was left over. His mother's farm, his wife's departure, his children's indifference. He thought about his son Derek, who lived in a penthouse worth $5 million in the heart of the city. Derek, who had never once asked his father how he was doing without circling back to money. Derek, who had built a career in real estate and married a woman named Vanessa who wore designer clothes and looked at Frank's flannel shirts with barely concealed disgust. He thought about his daughter Lisa, who lived 3 states away with her husband and 2 kids, who called once a month and spent most of the call talking about how expensive everything was, how hard it was to get ahead, how her father must understand because he'd been through the same thing. She never asked him about his health or his hobbies or the quiet that had settled over his life like a fog. He thought about the years he'd worked, the double shifts and the missed birthdays and the vacations he'd never taken. He'd put Derek through college, paid the tuition and the rent and the spending money, and when Derek graduated and wanted to get into real estate, Frank had co-signed the loan. When Derek met Vanessa and wanted a wedding, Frank had paid for the catering. When Derek needed a down payment on his first condo, Frank had taken out a second mortgage on his own house. It wasn't a gift, Derek had said. It was an investment, a bridge until things took off. And things had taken off, spectacularly. Derek was a multi-millionaire now, with a portfolio of properties and a name that got him into the best restaurants in town. But the bridge had never been repaid. Not a penny. Frank had never asked. That wasn't what fathers did. You gave, and you were grateful for the chance to give. It was supposed to be enough. The satisfaction of seeing your children succeed was supposed to warm you in your old age like a fire in the hearth. But Frank's hearth was cold. The house was empty, and the satisfaction, if it had ever existed, had curdled into something bitter. He folded the letter and tucked it back into the envelope. He'd deal with the farm later. There was no rush. The place had been falling apart for years, and a few more weeks wouldn't make any difference. That afternoon, his phone rang. It was Derek. Dad, Derek said, his voice warm and familiar, the same voice he used when he wanted something. How are you? Fine, Frank said. Busy. Good. Listen, I was wondering if you could come by the penthouse tonight. Vanessa and I have some news. Something we want to share with you. Frank felt his jaw tighten. What kind of news? It's good news, Derek said. Exciting. Just come by around 7, okay? We'll have dinner. It'll be nice. Frank agreed because he always agreed. and when he hung up, he sat in the silence of his kitchen and wondered what his son would ask for next. The farm, probably. Derek had mentioned it last time, dropping hints about development potential and tax write-offs. Derek had a way of making Frank's possessions sound like burdens, like problems waiting to be solved. At 6:45, Frank parked his truck in the underground garage of the Sterling, a high-rise that gleamed like a shard of glass against the evening sky. The lobby smelled like orchids and citrus, and the concierge greeted him with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Frank took the elevator to the 28th floor and walked down the hallway to the penthouse door. Derek opened it, looking polished in a button-down shirt and tailored slacks. Behind him, the penthouse stretched out in a panorama of city lights and minimalist furniture. Vanessa was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, holding a flute of champagne. Her smile was pleasant, practiced, the same smile she wore at charity galas and real estate mixers. "Dad?" Derek said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Come in. Can I get you something to drink?" "Water's fine." Frank sat on the edge of the white leather couch. The cushions were stiff, unforgiving. He felt out of place, like a stain on a clean surface. Derek and Vanessa took seats across from him, exchanging a glance that Frank recognized. They'd rehearsed this. "We have an announcement," Derek said. "Vanessa is pregnant." Frank blinked. A grandchild. The thought took a moment to register. He should have felt joy, a warm swell of anticipation. Instead, he felt a flicker of wariness. Derek had never called him over for good news without strings attached. "Congratulations," Frank said. "That's wonderful." "It is," Vanessa said, her voice smooth as honey. "But it also means we need to make some changes. The penthouse is great for 2 people, but it's not the kind of place you want to raise a child. No yard. No room for a nursery. We've been looking at houses, and we found one we love." "It's perfect." "That's great," Frank said. "I'm happy for you." Derek leaned forward, his expression earnest. "The thing is, Dad, the house is expensive. It's in the right neighborhood, with good schools and a safe community. But the down payment is steep. We've saved a lot, but we're still short." Frank felt the words coming. He could see them forming in the air like letters written in smoke. "We were thinking," Derek continued, "about the farm. Grandma's place. It's just sitting there, costing you money in taxes and upkeep. If you sold it, you could use the proceeds to help us with the down payment. It would be a gift to your grandchild. A legacy." Frank stared at his son. The man had a net worth in the millions. He drove a luxury SUV and took international vacations 3 times a year. And he was asking his retired father, who lived on a modest pension, to sell the family farm and hand over the money. "Derek," Frank said slowly, "I don't know what the farm is worth. I haven't even been out there yet." "It's worth something," Derek said. "The land alone has to be valuable. And whatever it's worth, it would make a huge difference for us. For your grandchild. Don't you want to be part of that?" Vanessa nodded, her eyes wide and earnest. "We want you to be close, Frank. We want our baby to know their grandfather. But we need your help to make that happen. It's not just money. It's about family." Frank looked at them, sitting in their glass tower with their champagne and their designer furniture, and felt a familiar ache in his chest. The ache of a man who had given and was now being told that he had more to give, that his assets were merely resources to be redistributed, that his needs, his wants, his future didn't matter. "I'll think about it," Frank said. "That's all I can promise right now." Derek's smile faltered for just a moment. "Of course, Dad. Take your time. We're not pushing. We just want you to be part of this." Frank left the penthouse 20 minutes later, after dinner was served on plates that cost more than his first car. He drove home in silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his mind turning over the conversation like a stone in his palm. He thought about the years of sacrifice, the exhaustion and the worry, the way he'd worked himself to the bone so Derek could have everything he never had. He thought about the college tuition and the wedding and the down payment, the loans he'd co-signed and the debts he'd quietly taken on. He thought about Lisa, who had called last week to tell him she and her husband were struggling, that her husband's business was failing, that she didn't know where to turn. He'd offered to help, of course. He always offered to help. And now his children were circling like vultures around the corpse of his mother's farm, picking at the bones of his inheritance, even as they lived in comfort and plenty. Frank pulled into his driveway and sat in the truck for a long time, staring at his house. The modest split level with its outdated kitchen and its leaky basement. The house Patricia had hated and left. The house his children visited only when they needed something. He got out of the truck and went inside. The silence was heavy, oppressive. He walked to the kitchen and opened the drawer where he kept his important papers. Bills, insurance documents, the deed to the house, and something else. A folder he hadn't looked at in years. He pulled it out and opened it, staring at the papers inside. Documents from a law firm in New York. A trust established by his maternal grandfather, a man who had built a fortune in shipping and had never trusted anyone with its existence. Margaret had told Frank about it once, when he was in his 20s. She'd made him promise to keep it secret, to never speak of it, not to anyone, not even his wife. The trust had grown. Over 6 decades, it had multiplied, guided by careful stewards and prudent investments. Frank had never touched a penny of it. He'd considered it, especially when Patricia left, but something held him back. A quiet voice that told him to wait, to watch. He looked at the current balance and felt his breath catch. Over $40 million. An amount so vast it seemed unreal, like a number from a dream. Frank closed the folder and put it back in the drawer. He sat at the kitchen table in the dark, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock on the wall. He thought about his son, asking for $500,000. He thought about his daughter, who had already tapped him for $20,000 last year and would be back for more soon enough. He thought about the way they looked at him, with a mixture of pity and expectation, like he was a resource to be used up and discarded. He thought about his mother, who had lived in that falling-down farmhouse for decades, waiting, always waiting. She had known what she was holding, and she had held it close. She had watched her grandchildren grow up and watched them walk away, and she had never once opened the door to the cellar. Frank stood up. He walked to the phone and dialed the number of the law firm that had sent him the letter. It was late, and no one answered. He left a message, his voice calm and measured. "This is Frank Turner. I'm calling about the estate. I need to come by the farm. There are some things I need to check." He hung up and went to bed. But he didn't sleep. He lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with possibilities he'd never allowed himself to imagine. He remembered all the times Derek had dismissed him. All the times Vanessa had looked through him like he was invisible. All the years he'd been treated like a walking ATM, a safety net, a relic from a simpler time. But he remembered the way Derek had laughed when Frank said he was retiring, as if the idea of his father having a life was amusing. He remembered the way Vanessa had rearranged the seating at Derek's birthday party so Frank was at the far end of the table, away from her wealthy friends. He remembered the Christmas when Derek and Lisa had argued about who would have to host him, and he'd pretended not to hear it if Frank closed his eyes. Something in him had shifted, had hardened. He wasn't sure when it had happened. Maybe it was the phone call tonight. Maybe it was the weight of the letter in his pocket, the proof that he was worth less to his son than a down payment. Maybe it was the folder in his drawer, whispering to him in the dark. He would go to the farm tomorrow. He would open the door to the cellar, the one his mother had always kept locked. He would find out what she had left him. And then he would decide, not whether to give, but whether to stop, whether to say enough, whether to look his children in the eye and tell them that the well had run dry, that there was nothing left to take. The thought should have frightened him. Instead, it felt like the first deep breath he'd taken in 30 years. He fell asleep to the sound of his own heartbeat, steady and determined. And when he woke the next morning, he knew exactly what he had to do. The drive out to the farm took longer than Frank remembered. The roads had changed in the years since he'd last made this trip. New housing developments swallowing up fields he'd known since childhood, strip malls sprouting where corn used to grow. He followed the old route by memory, turning off the highway onto a two-lane road that narrowed into gravel, then dirt, then nothing but tire tracks worn into the grass. The gate was still there, rusted and hanging crooked on its hinges. Frank got out to push it open, and the metal groaned in protest, scraping against the ground like it hadn't moved in years. He drove through and parked in front of the house. The farmhouse looked worse than he remembered. The white paint had peeled away in great patches, revealing gray wood beneath. The front porch sagged on its left side, and one of the support beams had cracked clean through. Weeds had overtaken the yard, waist-high and thick, brushing against the truck's undercarriage as he pulled in. The barn was a skeleton, just beams and shadows, the roof long since collapsed under the weight of winter snows. Frank sat in the truck for a long moment, staring at the house. He remembered summers here, running through the fields with his cousins, helping his father mend fences and bale hay. He remembered his mother on the porch, shelling peas or snapping beans, her hands moving with the rhythm of a woman who had worked hard her whole life and expected nothing else. She'd loved this place, loved it with a fierce, stubborn devotion that had made no sense to Frank when he was young. Why stay? Why cling to a piece of land that gave back so little? Now he understood. Or he was beginning to doubt. He got out of the truck and walked up the creaking steps. The front door was unlocked, just as it had always been. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and the musty smell of old fabric and wood. The living room was frozen in time, furniture draped in white sheets, the fireplace cold and empty. A grandfather clock stood against the wall, its hands frozen at 3:47, the pendulum still. Frank walked through the rooms, his footsteps echoing on the worn wooden floors. The kitchen was cluttered with old jars and canisters, a cast-iron skillet still sitting on the stove. The bedrooms upstairs held beds stripped of their linens, mattresses bare and stained with age. But it was the door at the back of the hallway that drew his attention. The door to the cellar. The one his mother had kept locked for as long as he could remember. Frank walked toward it, his heart beating faster than it should have. He tried the handle. It turned easily, with a click that echoed in the silence. The door swung open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. He went back to the truck and retrieved a flashlight from the glove compartment. Then he stood at the top of the stairs, the beam of light cutting through the gloom, and started down. The steps were stone, worn smooth by years of use. The air grew cooler as he descended, the temperature dropping by degrees. At the bottom, the flashlight revealed a room that had clearly not been disturbed in decades. Filing cabinets lined the walls, heavy and gray. Wooden crates were stacked in rows, their lids nailed shut. And against the far wall, leaning in a row, were paintings. Dozens of them, their canvases covered in a fine layer of dust. Frank walked to the nearest filing cabinet and pulled open the top drawer. It was full of folders, each labeled with a date. He pulled one at random. A deed. 50 acres of land purchased in 1964. He pulled another. Mineral rights to property in the same county. Another folder held stock certificates, shares in companies Frank had never heard of. Another held bonds, treasury notes, certificates of deposit. He went through the drawers methodically, his hands steady but his mind reeling. Land deeds, property titles, investment portfolios, a collection of assets that spanned decades, accumulated by a man who had apparently trusted nobody with his secrets. His grandfather, the shipping magnate who had died when Frank was just a boy, leaving behind a legacy of silence and wealth. At the bottom of the last drawer, Frank found a folder with his name on it. He opened it and pulled out a single sheet of paper. His mother's handwriting, shaky but clear. Frank, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I always knew you'd come out here eventually. The farm was never the inheritance. It was the key. Your grandfather built something over the decades, not for himself, but for you. For the one who never asked. I've watched you give and give to people who only take. I've watched your son, and I've seen the way he looks at you. Be careful with what's in this room. Be careful with them. Asterisk, asterisk love. Mom asterisk. Frank read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and tucked it into his shirt pocket. He walked to the nearest wooden crate and pried the lid open with the edge of his flashlight. Inside were more files, more documents, more evidence of a fortune carefully hidden and patiently accumulated. He walked to the paintings, lifting the dust covers on a few. Landscapes, mostly. A portrait of a woman he didn't recognize. A seascape that could have been a Turner or a Constable. He wasn't an expert, but he knew enough to understand that these weren't the kind of paintings you hung in a farmhouse living room. These were the kind you hung in museums. Frank sat down on a crate, the flashlight resting on his knee, the beam illuminating the room in a cone of pale light. He thought about his mother, living alone in this house for decades, sitting in the kitchen with her coffee and her books, watching the world go by. She'd known what was down here. She'd known, and she'd kept it secret, waiting for the right moment, waiting for Frank to be ready. He thought about Derek, about the penthouse and the champagne and the request for a down payment, about the look on his son's face when Frank had said he'd think about it, the slight flicker of irritation that had crossed his features before the practiced smile returned. Derek had expected him to say yes. Derek always expected him to say yes. Frank stood up and began to explore the rest of the room. There was a safe in the corner, the old-fashioned kind with a combination lock. He tried his mother's birthday. Nothing. His own birthday. Nothing. He tried the year his parents were married, and the lock clicked open. Inside the safe were more documents. A will. A trust agreement. A letter from his grandfather, written in a careful hand on yellowed paper, Frank. By the time you read this, I'll be gone. I don't know when that will be, but I know you'll find your way here eventually. You were always the quiet one, the one who watched and waited. That's why I chose you. Not your father, not your sister. You. What I've left you isn't just money. It's a test. A measure of who you really are. You've spent your life giving to people who don't deserve it. I've watched your children grow up, and I've seen the way they treat you. They think you're a fool. They think you're weak. They think you'll keep handing over pieces of yourself until there's nothing left. Prove them wrong. Don't be angry. Be patient. Watch. Wait. And when the time is right, show them exactly who you are. Your grandfather. William Turner. Frank folded the letter and put it with his mother's. He stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by evidence of a fortune that had been waiting for him his entire life, and felt something shift inside him. It was like a door opening, a door he hadn't even known was there. He'd spent so many years being the provider, the fixer, the one who cleaned up other people's messes. He'd been grateful for scraps, for the rare moments when his children remembered he existed. He'd convinced himself that giving was the same as love. But now he understood something he'd been too blind to see. His children didn't love him. They used him. They took and they took and they took, and when there was nothing left to take, they would walk away without a backward glance. Frank closed the safe and locked it. He walked back up the stairs, emerging into the dim light of the farmhouse living room. Dust motes danced in the air, catching the light from the windows. He stood in the center of the room and looked around, seeing the house not as a relic of the past, but as a fortress. He had been handed a weapon, a tool, a chance to rewrite the story of his life. He drove back to the city with the weight of the cellar pressing on his mind. When he got home, there was a message on his answering machine. Derek's voice, light and friendly. Hey, Dad. Just checking in. Wanted to see if you'd had a chance to think about what we talked about. We're going to look at the house again this weekend, and it would be great if you could come with us. Really get a feel for the place. Anyway, give me a call when you get this. Love you. Frank listened to the message twice, then deleted it. He walked to the kitchen drawer and pulled out the folder from the New York law firm. He opened it and looked at the balance. Over $42 million. A fortune that had been sitting there, untouched, for 6 decades. He closed the folder and put it back. Then he sat down at the table, pulled out a pen and a notebook, and began to write. He wrote a list of names. Derek, Vanessa, Lisa, her husband, Mark, the grandchildren. He wrote down every time they'd asked for something and the amount they'd asked for. He wrote down every time they'd dismissed him, talked down to him, made him feel small. He wrote down the promises they'd made and broken, the debts they'd incurred and never repaid, the future they'd dangled in front of him like a carrot on a stick. When he was done, he had 4 pages of closely written notes. He set down the pen and looked at what he'd written. It was a ledger of grievance, a record of decades of subtle and not-so-subtle disrespect. He had kept it all inside for so long, telling himself it didn't matter, that he was being too sensitive, that family was about forgiveness and moving on. But it did matter. It mattered a great deal. Frank folded the pages and tucked them into the same folder as the trust documents. Then he picked up the phone and called the law firm in New York. It was after hours, but he'd been given a personal number for emergencies. He dialed it, and a man named Edward Chun answered on the second ring. Mr. Turner, I was expecting your call. Edward, Frank said, his voice steady. I need to make some arrangements. Of course. What kind of arrangements? Frank paused. The words came slowly, deliberately. I need to know exactly what I have. Every asset, every investment, every account. I need a complete accounting of the trust's holdings. I can have that ready for you by the end of the week. And I need to make some changes, Frank continued. I want to update my will. I want to ensure that certain beneficiaries are removed. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Mr. Turner, if I may ask, is everything all right? Frank looked out the window at the darkened street, at the houses with their lighted windows and their families inside. He thought about his children, sleeping in their expensive homes, dreaming of the next thing they would take from him. "Everything's fine," Frank said. "I'm just making some adjustments, making sure my affairs are in order." "I understand. I'll prepare the documents." "One more thing," Frank said. "I want to keep this confidential. No one is to know about any of this. Not my children. Not anyone." "That can be arranged." Frank hung up and sat in the silence of his kitchen. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking the passage of time. He was 72 years old, retired, alone, and his children thought he was a source of money to be tapped whenever they needed more. They had no idea what he was worth. They had no idea what he was capable of. They had no idea that the father they'd dismissed, the man they'd treated like a faded photograph from a life they'd outgrown, was the one who held all the cards. Frank smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who had finally seen the truth and decided to act on it. The game was about to change. And the players had no idea what was coming. The days that followed took on a strange rhythm. Frank woke at his usual hour, made his coffee, walked his usual route through the neighborhood. But everything felt different now. The familiar streets looked sharper, more vivid, as if he was seeing them for the first time through new eyes. The neighbors waved, and he waved back. The mailman came, and Frank took his letters inside. But his mind was elsewhere, turning over plans and possibilities like a man polishing stones. The file from Edward Chun arrived on Friday, a thick package delivered by courier with a signature required. Frank took it to his study and closed the door. He sat at his desk and spread the contents across the surface. It was everything he'd asked for and more. A complete accounting of the trust, broken down into categories and subcategories. Real estate holdings across 4 states. Commercial properties, residential developments, raw land. A portfolio of stocks and bonds that would make a Wall Street analyst weep with envy. Art collections, rare books, antique furniture stored in climate-controlled warehouses. And cash. Liquid, available, transferable cash in accounts that had been accumulating interest for decades. Frank spent the afternoon going through every page. He read each document carefully, making notes in the margins with a pencil. He didn't understand all of it. The language of high finance was foreign to him, filled with terms he'd only ever heard on television. But he understood enough. He understood the bottom line. He understood the power that sat in his hands. When he was finished, he closed the file and set it aside. Then he went to the kitchen and made himself a sandwich, the same kind he'd been making for 40 years. Ham and cheese on white bread, with a slice of tomato and a thin spread of mustard. He ate it standing at the counter, looking out the window at his backyard. The grass needed mowing. The fence needed painting. There were 1,000 small repairs he'd been putting off, telling himself he'd get to them eventually. He would get to them now, but not because he had to, because he wanted to, because the house was his, and he would take care of it, and no one would take it away from him. His phone rang at 7:15. He checked the caller ID. Derek. Frank let it go to voicemail. He listened to the message later, his son's voice bright and insistent. "Hey, Dad, just checking in again. Vanessa and I are going to look at the house tomorrow afternoon. We'd really love for you to come, just to see it. Get a feel for where your grandchild is going to grow up. Call me back when you get this." Frank deleted the message without responding. He'd already decided he wasn't going to the house. He wasn't going to let Derek parade him around like a prop, nodding and smiling while his son and daughter-in-law talked about square footage and granite countertops and the importance of family. He wasn't going to be the old man in the corner, the one they had to include because it was polite that he was done being polite. That the next morning, Frank drove to the farm again. This time he came prepared. He brought work gloves, a crowbar, and a duffel bag. He spent the morning in the cellar, going through every crate and cabinet with meticulous care. He cataloged the contents, made a list of everything he found, and secured the most valuable items in the duffel bag to take home. He found deeds to properties he'd never known about, mineral rights that generated annual royalties, stock certificates from companies that had since been absorbed by larger conglomerates, their value multiplied many times over. He found a leather-bound ledger that belonged to his grandfather, filled with cramped handwriting and meticulous entries dating back to 1923. The old man had been a hoarder of assets, a squirrel gathering nuts for a winter that never came, but the most surprising find was the jewelry. A wooden box, small and unassuming, tucked behind a row of filing cabinets. Inside were velvet pouches, each containing pieces that gleamed in the flashlight's beam. Gold. silver, gemstones, a diamond necklace that made Frank's breath catch, a ruby ring that looked like it belonged on a queen's finger, his grandmother's wedding band, still inscribed with the date of her marriage in 1918. Frank closed the box and set it carefully in the duffel bag. He would have to have these appraised. He would have to be careful about how he handled them. But they were his now, and he would decide what to do with them. That he drove back to the city with the duffel bag on the passenger seat, a silent companion. He felt a strange sense of calm, an almost serene certainty that had been missing from his life for as long as he could remember. He'd spent so many years reacting to the demands of others, bending to their needs and expectations. Now he was the one in control. He was the one holding the cards. When he got home, he found Lisa waiting on his front porch. She was sitting on the steps, scrolling through her phone, a designer handbag at her feet. She looked up when Frank pulled into the driveway and stood, brushing off her jeans with a practiced motion. She was 45, 2 years younger than Derek, with the same dark hair and blue eyes that ran through the Turner line. But where Derek had grown into a polished, confident man, Lisa had developed a pinched, anxious expression that made her look older than she was. "Dad," she said, as Frank got out of the truck. "I've been waiting for an hour. I called, but you didn't answer." "I was out," Frank said. "What are you doing here?" Lisa's face crumpled. "I need to talk to you. It's important." Frank unlocked the front door and gestured for her to follow him inside. He set the duffel bag in the hallway, out of sight, and led her to the kitchen. He filled the kettle and put it on the stove, the familiar ritual of making tea, buying him time. Lisa sat at the kitchen table, her hands twisting in her lap. She looked thinner than the last time he'd seen her, the hollows of her cheeks more pronounced. Her eyes were red-rimmed, like she'd been crying. "Mark's business is in trouble," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's worse than I told you before. He's taken on too much debt, and the bank is threatening to call on the loans. We're going to lose the house." Frank poured the hot water into 2 mugs and set one in front of her. He sat down across from her, his face unreadable. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said. Lisa looked up at him, her eyes desperate. "Dad, I don't know where else to turn. We've tried everything. We've sold what we can. But it's not enough. We need help. We need money." "How much?" Frank asked. Lisa swallowed. $80,000. It would get us through the next few months, give us time to refinance. I know it's a lot, but I promise we'll pay it back. I'll get a job. I'll do whatever it takes. Just please, Dad. I don't want my kids to lose their home." Frank looked at his daughter. He remembered the little girl who used to crawl into his bed after a nightmare, clutching her stuffed rabbit, her small body trembling. He remembered teaching her to ride a bike, running alongside her as she wobbled down the street. He remembered walking her down the aisle at her wedding, her hand on his arm, her smile bright and unguarded. That girl was gone. In her place was this woman, this stranger, who only called when she needed something, who had never once asked how he was doing without circling back to her own problems. "Lisa," Frank said slowly, "you came all this way to ask me for $80,000. Do you know where that money would come from?" Lisa blinked. "I assumed you had savings. You always said you had a cushion. I have a pension. I have a house that's paid off. And I have about $15,000 in a savings account that I've been building for years. That's my retirement, my health care, my future." Lisa's face fell. "But you can help. You can always help. You helped Derek with his wedding. You helped him with his first condo. Why won't you help me?" "Because I'm tired," Frank said. "I'm tired of being treated like an ATM. I'm tired of being the last resort. I'm tired of being called only when something goes wrong." Lisa stared at him, her mouth open. "That's not fair. You've always what?" Frank interrupted. "You call me once a month. You talk about yourself for an hour, and then you hang up. You never ask about my health. You never ask if I need anything. You don't even know what I do with my days." Lisa's face flushed. "I have my own life, Dad. I have a husband and children and responsibilities. I can't be checking in on you every 5 minutes. Every 5 minutes, Frank shook his head. "I'm not asking for every 5 minutes. I'm asking for 5 minutes once in a while. I'm asking for you to see me as a person, not a resource." Lisa stood up abruptly, scraping her chair against the floor. "I can't believe this. I came to you in my time of need, and you're lecturing me about gratitude. Do you have any idea how hard my life is? How hard it's been?" Frank stood too. "I know exactly how hard it's been. I raised you. I paid for your college. I helped you with your wedding. I loaned you money when Mark's first business failed. I've been there every single time you needed me. But when have you ever been there for me?" Lisa grabbed her bag and headed for the front door. "I don't need this. I don't need you guilt-tripping me when I'm already at my lowest. I thought you loved me. I thought you would want to help." Frank followed her to the door. "I do love you. That's why I'm saying this. You need to hear it. You and Derek both. I'm not a bank. I'm your father. And I'm done being treated like I don't matter." Lisa pulled the door open, but Frank put a hand on it, holding it closed. She turned to look at him, startled by the firmness of his grip. $80,000, Frank said quietly. "You came all this way to ask me for $80,000. Do you know what that money means to me? It means I can't get my roof fixed. It means I can't replace my furnace. It means if something happens to me, I'm done. I'm out of options." Lisa's lip trembled. "So you're saying no?" "I'm saying no," Frank confirmed. "And I'm saying that from now on, I need you to treat me like a father, not a source of funds. That's the deal. If you want to be part of my life, you have to be part of it. All of it. Not just the part where you take." Lisa stared at him for a long moment. Then she pulled the door open and walked out, her footsteps sharp and angry on the front walk. She got into her car and drove away without looking back. Frank closed the door and leaned against it, his heart pounding. He'd done it. He'd said no. For the first time in his life, he'd drawn a line and refused to cross it. That felt terrifying. It also felt right. That he went back to the kitchen and poured himself a cup of tea. His hands were shaking slightly, but he forced himself to drink it, to breathe, to let the adrenaline pass. He thought about Lisa's face, the shock and anger that had flashed in her eyes. She would tell Derek. Derek would call him. There would be a confrontation. But Frank didn't care anymore. He was done being invisible. He thought about the cellar, the filing cabinets, the paintings, and the jewelry. He thought about the $42 million and the power it represented. He thought about his mother, who had lived her whole life in secret, who had kept her mouth shut and let people underestimate her. Frank smiled. He was tired of being underestimated. He was tired of being overlooked. It was time for his family to learn the truth. Not all of it. Not the whole truth. But enough. He would start small. He would test the waters. And when they least expected it, he would show them exactly who they had been dismissing. The phone rang. Derek. Frank watched it ring until it stopped. A moment later, a text arrived at "Dad, Lisa just called me. She said you refused to help her." "What the hell is going on?" Frank typed back slowly. "We need to talk. All of us. Come to the farm on Saturday. I'll explain everything." He hit send and set the phone down. Then he walked to the study, pulled out the file from Edward Chun, and began to make his plans. Saturday was 3 days away. It wasn't much time. But Frank Turner had waited 72 years. He could wait 3 more days. Saturday morning arrived gray and damp, the kind of overcast day that made the world feel muffled and still. Frank had been up since 5, moving through his house with the quiet efficiency of a man preparing for battle. He'd cleaned the kitchen, made a pot of coffee, and laid out a simple spread on the counter. Store-bought pastries, a bowl of fruit, and a pitcher of water. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was making a point that the farmhouse had been tidied as much as he could manage in 3 days. He'd swept the floors, aired out the rooms, and uncovered the furniture in the living room. The sheets had been draped over the couches and chairs for so long that the fabric underneath was faded in patches, but it didn't matter. The house looked lived in now, or at least it looked like someone cared enough to try. Frank stood on the front porch at 9:45, his hands in his jacket pockets, watching the gravel road that led to the gate. He'd told Derek to come at 10, and Derek was never early for anything. Frank had noticed that about his son over the years. Derek showed up when it was convenient for him, when he'd squeezed every other obligation out of his schedule and had nothing left but family. The first car to arrive was Lisa's. She pulled up in her silver sedan, her face pinched and tight behind the windshield. She parked next to Frank's truck and got out, slamming the door harder than necessary. She was wearing jeans and a sweater, practical clothes that seemed out of place on her, like she'd dressed down to make a point. "Dad," she said, her voice clipped. "This better be good." "Come inside," Frank said. "We'll wait for Derek." Lisa followed him into the house, her eyes darting around the living room like she was looking for something. "You've been cleaning," she said, with a hint of surprise in her voice. "I've been doing a lot of things," Frank replied. "Have a seat." Lisa perched on the edge of the couch, her hands in her lap. She didn't look at Frank. She looked at the floor, the window, anywhere but at him. The silence between them was thick, weighted with the words that had been exchanged 3 days earlier. Derek arrived 20 minutes late. Frank watched him pull up in his black SUV, polished and gleaming against the gray landscape. Vanessa was in the passenger seat, her face obscured by oversized sunglasses. Frank was not surprised. He'd known Derek would bring her. It was always the two of them, a united front, presenting themselves as a package deal. Dad, Derek said, as he got out of the car. His voice was controlled, pleasant, but there was an edge underneath. Nice to see you. Sorry we're late. Traffic. Traffic, Frank repeated. On a Saturday morning. In the country. Derek's smile flickered. Well, you know how it is. Come on, Vanessa. Let's see what Dad has to show us. Vanessa took off her sunglasses and looked around with undisguised disdain. The farmhouse, the overgrown yard, the skeletal remains of the barn, none of it met her standards. She didn't bother to hide that fact. I can't believe you dragged us all the way out here, Frank, she said. Couldn't we have done this at your house? This is my house, Frank said. Now come inside. They followed him into the living room, where Lisa was still sitting on the edge of the couch. Derek nodded at his sister, a brief acknowledgement that held no warmth. Vanessa sat next to Lisa, smoothing her designer pants as she settled into the faded cushions. Frank stood in the center of the room, facing them. He felt his heartbeat steady in his chest, calm and measured. He'd spent his whole life standing in the background, letting others take the lead. Now it was his turn to. I asked you here because we need to talk, Frank began. All of us. About the farm. About the future. About our family. Derek leaned back in his chair, crossing his legs. Okay, talk. Frank walked over to the fireplace and rested his hand on the mantel. Your grandmother left this place to me. That's not a secret. But what I didn't know until recently is that she left me more than just the farm. There's a history here, a legacy, and it's time you knew about it. Vanessa's eyes narrowed. What kind of legacy? The kind that goes back generations, Frank said. Your great-grandfather built something. He was a careful man. Quiet. He didn't trust banks or institutions. He put his wealth into things he could hold, things that would last. Derek uncrossed his legs and leaned forward. Dad, what are you talking about? Frank walked to the hallway and opened the door to the cellar. Come see for yourself. They followed him down the narrow staircase, their footsteps echoing on the worn stone. Frank turned on the light, a bare bulb that cast a weak yellow glow across the room. The filing cabinets gleamed dully. The wooden crates sat stacked against the walls. The paintings leaned in their dusty row, waiting. What is all this? Lisa asked, her voice hushed. Frank opened the top drawer of the nearest filing cabinet and pulled out a folder. He handed it to Derek. Open it. Derek took the folder and opened it. His eyes scanned the documents inside, and Frank watched his son's face change. The confident smirk faded. The easy posture stiffened. Derek's jaw tightened as he flipped through the pages, reading names and numbers that made no sense to someone who had never imagined them. This is... Derek stopped. He looked at Frank, his eyes wide. Dad, this says you own land in 3 states. Mineral rights. Stock portfolios. What is this? Your great-grandfather's legacy, Frank said. Your grandmother kept it safe. And now it's mine. Vanessa snatched the folder from Derek's hands and read over the documents. Her face drained of color. This can't be right. There must be a mistake. There's no mistake, Frank said. I've had it verified by a law firm in New York. The trust is real. The assets are real. I didn't know about any of it until a few months ago. But I know now. Lisa's voice was a whisper. How much, Dad? How much is it worth? Frank met her eyes. Enough. More than enough. Derek stood abruptly, knocking his chair back. You've had this all along all these years, and you never said anything. We've been struggling, Dad. We've been asking you for help, and you knew you had this. I didn't know, Frank said, his voice calm. Not until recently. But even if I had known, it wouldn't have changed anything. What does that mean? Derek demanded. It means I've spent my whole life giving you everything I had, Frank said. Your education, your wedding, your first house. Every time you needed something, I was there. I worked double shifts. I took out loans. I mortgaged my own house so you could have yours. And you know what? Not once, not a single time, did you ever say thank you. Not in a way that meant anything. Derek's face was red. That's not true. We've always been grateful. Have you? Frank asked. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've treated me like a source of money. Like I'm a bank you can withdraw from whenever you run short. And when I said no to Lisa the other day, she came running to you. She called me selfish. She called me a bad father. Lisa's voice cracked. Dad, that's not what I meant. I was upset. I was scared. I know you were scared, Frank said. That's the part that makes me sad. Because you were scared of losing your house, and your first instinct was to call me and ask for money. Not to talk to your husband. Not to look for a job. Not to sell anything you own. You came to me because you thought I was your safety net. Your emergency fund. Vanessa stepped forward, her voice sharp. This is ridiculous. You can't stand there and lecture us about money when you're sitting on a fortune. You've been hiding this from us for years. You've been lying to us. Frank turned to her. I never lied. I didn't know. But even if I had known, it wouldn't have been your business. This is my inheritance. My history. My choice. Derek's fists were clenched at his sides. So what now? You're just going to cut us off, leave us out in the cold? Frank walked back toward the stairs. No, I'm not going to cut you off. I'm going to give you a choice. He led them back up to the living room. The light was brighter up here, filtering through the dusty windows. Frank gestured for them to sit. I've prepared a proposal, he said. A way for all of us to move forward. He pulled a stack of papers from his jacket pocket and handed one to each of them. Derek, Vanessa, Lisa. They took them reluctantly, their eyes scanning the words. What is this? Derek asked. It's a contract, Frank said. It's simple. I'll help each of you, but on my terms. You'll get a one-time payment. No more. After that, you're on your own. No more loans. No more bailouts. No more using me as your backup plan. Lisa looked up, her face pale. A one-time payment. How much? Enough to cover the immediate problems, Frank said. Lisa, I'll pay off the debt on your house. Derek, I'll contribute to that down payment you talked about. But after that, the door closes. You'll never get another penny from me. And if you ever treat me like I'm irrelevant again, like I'm a burden or an inconvenience, I'll cut you off completely. Vanessa laughed, a harsh, sharp sound. You can't be serious. You expect us to agree to this to be grateful for what we should already have. Frank looked at her. You don't deserve any of it. That's the truth. But I'm not doing this because you deserve it. I'm doing it because I'm your father. Because I want to be able to look at myself in the mirror and know that I gave you every chance I could. But I'm done being used. Derek stared at the papers in his hand. You're really doing this, Dad. You're drawing a line. I'm drawing a line, Frank agreed. And I'm not crossing it again. The silence stretched out. Lisa looked like she was about to cry. Vanessa looked like she was about to scream. Derek looked like he was trying to figure out an angle, a loophole, a way to turn this back in his favor. Take it home, Frank said. Read it carefully. Talk about it. You have a week to decide. But understand this. If you choose to walk away, you walk away for good. No second chances. No appeals. He opened the front door and stood beside it, waiting. Derek and Vanessa went first, their footsteps heavy on the porch. Lisa lingered, her face desperate. Dad, she said, her voice barely a whisper. What happened to us? We used to be a family. We can still be a family, Frank said. But not like this. Not with you taking and me giving until there's nothing left. If you want to be my daughter, be my daughter. Not my creditor. Lisa nodded slowly. She walked out the door and got into her car without looking back. Frank watched them drive away, the dust from the gravel road settling behind their vehicles. He stood on the porch for a long time, feeling the weight of what he'd done settle over him like a blanket. It wasn't over. It was just beginning. They would fight him. They would try to guilt him. They would scheme and manipulate and do everything they could to change his mind. But Frank Turner was not the same man he had been a week ago. He had patience. He had resources. And he had the quiet, unshakable conviction that he was finally doing what he should have done decades ago. He went back inside and closed the door behind him. The farmhouse was quiet now, settling around him like an old friend. He walked to the kitchen and poured himself a cup of coffee. The pieces were in place. The game was set that now all he had to do was wait for them to make their move. That the week passed in a strange, suspended silence. Frank went about his routine with a calm he hadn't felt in years. He walked his route, drank his coffee, mowed his lawn. He didn't check his phone obsessively. He didn't wait by the mailbox for a reply. He simply let the days unfold, trusting that whatever was coming would arrive when it was meant to. On Thursday afternoon, Edward Chin called. The legal documents were ready. The trust had been restructured, the beneficiaries redefined. Frank had made his choices carefully, with the precision of a man who had spent a lifetime observing and learning. He'd left nothing to chance. Every contingency had been accounted for. "You're certain about this, Mr. Turner?" Edward had asked, his voice neutraled. "I've never been more certain of anything," Frank had replied. That on Saturday morning, Frank drove to the farm one last time. He walked through the house, touching the walls, the furniture, the things his mother had held and cherished. He stood in the kitchen and remembered the smell of her cooking, the sound of her humming as she worked. He felt her presence in the creak of the floorboards, the slant of the afternoon light through the window. Then he walked to the cellar and opened the safe. Inside, in addition to the documents he'd already removed, was a small velvet pouch he hadn't noticed before. He opened it and found a key. Old, brass, tarnished with age. He didn't know what it opened, but he slipped it into his pocket anyway. Some things waited until you were ready to find them. That the meeting was set for 2 p.m. at the farmhouse. Frank arrived early and made a pot of coffee. He arranged the chairs in the living room, a semicircle facing the fireplace. He wanted them to see him clearly. He wanted them to understand that this was his territory, his domain. Derek and Vanessa arrived first. They came in the black SUV, polished and gleaming. Derek wore a suit, which Frank found amusing. It was as if his son thought dressing formally would give him an advantage. Vanessa wore a designer dress and heels that sank into the gravel. She looked uncomfortable, out of her element, and Frank felt a small, private satisfaction at the sight that Lisa arrived 10 minutes later. She was alone, her face drawn and tired. She hadn't brought her husband, which Frank noted. Perhaps she was learning. Perhaps she understood that this was something she had to face on her own. "Thank you for coming," Frank said, as they filed into the living room. "Please sit down." They took their places. Derek and Vanessa sat together on the couch, their body language closed and defensive. Lisa sat in the armchair, her hands folded in her lap. Frank remained standing, his back to the fireplace. "I asked you here to give you my final answer," Frank began. "You've had the contract for a week. You've had time to think about it. I'm going to assume you've made your decisions." Derek leaned forward. "We've talked about it, Dad. Vanessa and I. And we've decided we can't accept your terms. It's not fair. You're asking us to agree to something we had no part in creating. This is our family, too. We have a right to know what's going on." Frank looked at his son. "You don't have a right to anything. That's what I've been trying to tell you. You're entitled to nothing. Everything you have, you've earned. That's a good thing. But you've also spent your whole life assuming I would be there to catch you. That's not a right. It's a privilege. And privileges can be revoked." Vanessa's voice cut through the air, sharp and brittle. "This is absurd. We're not going to stand here and be lectured by you. You've been hiding money from us for years. You've been playing games with us. And now you want us to sign a contract like we're employees." Frank turned to her. "I've never hidden anything from you. I didn't know about the trust until recently. And even if I had, it wouldn't have been your concern. This isn't your money. It's mine. And I get to decide what happens to it." Lisa spoke up, her voice small. "Dad, we're your children. We love you. We don't want to fight with you." Frank looked at his daughter. The love in her voice was real. He could feel it. But it was tangled up with years of expectation, years of thinking he would always be there to fix things. He had to untangle that knot, even if it hurt. "I know you love me," Frank said. "And I love you. That's why I'm doing this. Because I want to have a relationship with you that isn't based on money. I want to be your father, not your safety net. But that means I have to stop being your safety net. It means you have to stand on your own." Derek stood up, his face flushed. "This is a mistake, Dad. You're going to regret this. You're going to be alone. No one is going to come visit you. No one is going to take care of you when you get old." Frank felt the words land like a blow. But he didn't flinch. He'd expected this. He'd been preparing for it. "I appreciate your concern for my old age," Frank said, his voice calm. "But I've already made arrangements. I have more than enough to take care of myself. I won't be a burden to any of you." Vanessa stood up beside Derek. "We're done with this. We're not signing anything. We're not accepting your terms. You can keep your money, Frank. But don't expect us to pretend everything's fine." She grabbed her purse and headed for the door. Derek followed her, pausing at the threshold to look back at Frank. "You're making a mistake," he said. "You'll see. When you're sitting in that empty house, all alone, you'll think about this moment. And you'll wish you'd made a different choice." Frank watched them walk to the car. He watched them drive away, the dust rising behind the SUV. He didn't feel angry. He didn't feel sad. He felt something else, something he hadn't expected. Relief. Lisa was still sitting in the armchair, her face in her hands. "Dad," she said, her voice muffled. "I don't know what to do. I don't want to lose you, but I don't know how to be what you want me to be." Frank walked over and knelt beside her chair. "You don't have to be anything," he said. "You just have to be my daughter. That's all I've ever wanted." Lisa looked up at him, her eyes red. "I don't know if I can. I've been so scared, Dad. For so long. I've been so scared of losing everything. Mark's business, the house, the kids' futures. I thought if I could just get enough money, everything would be okay. I didn't realize I was losing you in the process." Frank took her hand. "You're not losing me. I'm right here. But I need you to stop looking at me like I'm the answer to all your problems. I can't be that. I never could. I'm just your father. I'm just a man." Lisa laughed, a wet, shaky sound. "You've never been just a man. You've always been bigger than that. You've always been the one who fixed everything. And I've always been the one who let you think that was possible," Frank said. "But it's not. I can't fix everything. I can't make your marriage work. I can't make your husband's business succeed. I can't give your children a future. Those are things you have to build for yourself. And you can. You're strong. You're smart. You've just forgotten how to believe in yourself." Lisa wiped her eyes. "What about Derek? What about Vanessa?" Frank shook his head. "They'll have to figure it out. I've given them the offer. If they accept it, they accept it. If they don't, they don't. But I'm not going to chase them. I'm done chasing." Lisa nodded slowly. "I'll sign the contract, Dad. I'll accept the offer. And I'll try. I'll try to be better." Frank squeezed her hand. "That's all I ask." He walked her to the door and watched her drive away. Then he went back inside and sat down in the chair she'd vacated. The house was quiet, settling around him like an old blanket. He thought about his mother, sitting in this very room, waiting for him to come back. He thought about his grandfather, building his fortune in secret, never trusting anyone with the truth. And he thought about the key in his pocket. He pulled it out and looked at it. Old, brass, tarnished. What did it open? He'd assumed it was for something in the cellar, but he'd checked every lock down there, and none of them matched. It was a mystery, a loose thread, a final secret waiting to be uncovered. Frank turned the key over in his palm. He didn't know what it opened. He didn't know where to look. But he knew the answer would come when he was ready. He slipped the key back into his pocket and walked to the kitchen. The coffee was cold, so he poured it out and made a fresh pot. While he waited for it to brew, he looked out the window at the overgrown yard, the skeletal barn, the fields that had been fallow for years. He saw the farm not as it was, but as it could be. Restored, rebuilt, alive. Maybe he'd do that. Maybe he'd stay out here, fix up the house, work the land. Maybe he'd turn it into something new. Something that was his, entirely his. His phone buzzed. A text from Derek, **. I've decided to accept your offer. I'll have my lawyer look over the contract. But this isn't over, Dad. Don't think it is. **. Frank read the message and smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who knew he'd won, who knew the battle was over even if his opponent didn't realize it yet. He typed back a single word. *understood. Then he set the phone aside and poured his coffee. He walked back into the living room and stood by the window, looking out at the land that had been in his family for 3 generations. The clouds were breaking, patches of blue appearing in the gray sky. The sun was trying to come out. Frank took a sip of his coffee and felt the warmth spread through his chest. He thought about his mother, her voice in his memory, her letter in his pocket. Be careful with them. He had been careful. He had been patient. And now it was done. He'd drawn the line. He'd stood his ground. And he'd shown them all exactly who he was. The farmhouse settled around him, quiet and peaceful. Outside, the first rays of sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the fields. Frank Turner stood at the window and watched the light move across the land. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt completely at peace. He reached into his pocket and touched the old brass key. There were still secrets to uncover. There was still work to be done. But that was for another day. Today, he was content to stand in the sunlight, on his land, in his home, and know that he had finally, fully, become the man his mother had always known he could be.